First of all, since this is an international audience, obviously you have probably heard the joint statement coming from both sides of the aisle and both houses of Congress in the United States, again urging President Biden to take tougher steps to protect certain freedoms that the United States might feel are lacking in Hong Kong because of this new change to the electoral process. What would be your immediate response to the prospect of tougher action from the United States on Hong Kong?
Well, I repeat the point that I've previously made about the U.S. Statements about Hong Kong, is that Hong Kong is a free and open society. I think that's a very important factor to bear in mind. And after the passing of the national security law, the society has reverted into a rational, inclusive, and a very peaceful society, so people can enjoy their rights. So I would say that please look at the actual facts and then see what's happening in Hong Kong.
Why does Hong Kong need electoral change? If you look at it, the facts are there is no more pan-Democrats in the Legislative Council. There is no more technically opposition parties in the Legislative Council. Why does Hong Kong need reform?
Well, the experiences of Hong Kong have ranged from what I think has been described from 2003, 2012, and 15, 16, 19. All this sort of happenings has really exposed Hong Kong into a place that might endangering the electoral system and the overall political structure of Hong Kong. And it is for that reason that there is need for some changes. And of course, when we're looking at changes, we're looking at improvement, because what is being dealt with by the National People's Congress is to look at improvements in order to ensure that the electoral systems will continue to move forward in a way that will adhere to the one country, two systems, and of course also a very important feature of Patriot administering Hong Kong.
Is it moving forward, though, or is it taking a step back to eventually move 2 steps forward? Because the changes that are at least being proposed, what we understand, is that you'll broaden the Electoral Commission to choose the chief executive. They will get broader powers. They're pro-establishment, pro-Beijing, and they will be able to pick the candidates for the Legislative Council, as well as potentially vote for their inclusion in the Legislative Council. That, to me, and to many people in society who are not part of the consultative process, say we don't have a voice.
Well, you must look at the matter in the round and look at it perhaps in this way. If we look at how the chief executive is to be selected and the Legislative Council is to be formed, according to Articles 45 and 68 of the Basic Law, it has to take into account the actual situation in Hong Kong. That's expressly stated there. The actual situation in Hong Kong, as I said, have allowed certain things, has rendered certain things to be changed in order for the stability and prosperity of Hong Kong to be maintained. And that's a very important feature of one country, two systems. And of course, apart from the street violence that we've had in 2019, we've also seen certain of these separatism, anti-Chinese sentiments creeping or perhaps manifesting in the political structure of Hong Kong. And that's not going to be sustainable. That's not going to be beneficial to the people of Hong Kong. And therefore, steps will need to be taken in order to improve the system. When one improves an electoral system, and it is well set out in case law in the European Court of Human Rights, that one takes into account the historical development of the particular state or jurisdiction, the cultural diversity, the political thoughts and views of certain people, and of course also the historical and current state of the political development. So the electoral systems anywhere in the world may need to be adjusted, improved, and that's exactly what the National People's Congress is doing, and which is something that I think everywhere in the world will have to do in order to ensure that the democratic system continues to move forward.
You mentioned Articles 45 and 68. They both state, the 45 states, that the ultimate aim for the election of chief executive is universal suffrage. And 68 is for the Legislative Council. Same basic article saying universal suffrage is the ultimate aim. How do you maintain those articles and the letter of the law that it's the ultimate aim of have universal suffrage when you're faced with the prospect that a pro-Beijing or Beijing-picked, essentially, committee would then be able to choose whomever they like to be in the Legislative Council. That, to me, as I said earlier, sounds like a step back to get to 2 steps or 3 steps forward, ultimate aim.
Well, two points to react to your comment. First of all, it's made very clear that Articles 45 and 68 are not to be changed. There is nothing that touches the ultimate aim of universal suffrage for the Chief Executive and the Legislative Council. So that remains the position, and that's not going to change. The second is about, you keep using the phrase taking a step back and moving forward. Even if it is taking a step back but moving in a bigger and more stronger way forward, that is going to be beneficial to Hong Kong and its people as well as for the country as a whole. Because if I can use a metaphor of a sailing boat, moving forward, if it starts to steer off track for too long and too far away, one might have to steer it back, and then it will then continue to move in the right forward to maintain Hong Kong's long-term stability and prosperity.
You've written about the need for a patriotic or a patriot administration. What does it mean to be a patriot? And can you still criticize the Communist Party of China? Can you criticize Xi Jinping? Can you criticize the chief executive and still be considered a patriot? I'm a patriot to my country, but I can criticize my government quite vociferously as the member of the press.
Right. I think there are many ways in which people can talk about patriots. Anywhere in the world, when people go for election, they try and show how much more patriotic they are than their opponents in order to win the election. I think that is a very clear feature that everybody can see that's happening. So therefore, patriots administering Hong Kong is nothing new. So what is a patriot? In a normal situation, I think everyone should be a patriot. Everyone should not impair on the interests of the country. And if you love Hong Kong, you will necessarily love the country. You must respect the Chinese culture and the Chinese nation as a whole. And you must also be respecting the resumption of the exercise of sovereignty by China over Hong Kong. These, I think, were the words of Mr. Deng Xiaoping back in the 1980s, and they remain true. And the way he described his third element is someone who doesn't do anything that impair the interests of Hong Kong. And that's exactly what patriots would.
What level of criticism is allowed, though?
Well, criticisms that are fair and rational and fact-based would, of course, be well taken, because in a democratic society, one needs to take those on board and then analyze it in order to formulate the policy.
Now, under these new charges in this long arraignment period, well, it was actually a short arraignment period of about 4 days with these 47 individuals, the 35-plus group that wanted, that have been now arraigned and are still being held without bail. It's interesting because their charges are conspiracy to commit subversion is the charge that has been levied against them. But again, I come back to the basic law in Article 52 stipulates some of the suspicion that they were committing conspiracy to have subversion. That is perfectly allowed in the basic law. The act of basically blocking the budget in order to force the chief executive to resign. So that was according to the letter of the law.
Steve, if I may, I
Yes.
believe I can call you Steve. First of all, we can't discuss the case because sub judice, and neither I nor in fact anyone should be discussing the case, because we don't want any trial by the public and therefore jeopardizing the interests of the justice as well as the interests of the defendant. When you look at a particular angle of the rights of certain people being able to deal with a budget or deal with the votes, of course there are also duties of those individuals that are also in the basic law, implied in the basic law when they take certain public office. And so those are, one mustn't look at one phrase in the basic law and say, if I'm doing that, that's okay, because one has to look at the matter in context and as a whole. And that I must emphasize again, I'm not talking about the case, and neither should anyone.
What exactly is the alleged act of subversion, though? Is it advocating the ousting of the chief executive, or is it vowing to vote down a budget before you're even seeing the budget?
The charge is well set out, and it has already been read out in the courts. So I think it is known and it has been reported. It would not be right for me, without the charge in front of me, to try and memorize in case I forget exact and precise wordings. And I think you know better, Steve, that we should move away from this topic and talk about other things, because we cannot talk about a case, I cannot talk about a case, and neither can you.
Okay, on the electoral reform, why no consultative period? Why is there not going to be consultations? Carrie Lam said yesterday there will not be enough time for a consultative period with the people of Hong Kong. It kind of goes back to the complaints a lot of people in Hong Kong have, is that the national security law was thrust upon them, the electoral changes were thrust upon them, and that they have no say. So why the rush?
First of all, we go back to very fundamental legal basis that the political structure, the design of it, of course, is a matter within the central authorities' purview. And so, therefore, it is within their purview, duty and function in order to ensure that the Constitution is enforced, etc., by the NPC. And as I already told you, because of what happened in the past years, it's sort of been aggravating and growing in terms of the concerns, and we've seen how the Legislative Council has been used as a platform, not so much as doing rational debates as Legislative Council should be, but perhaps for chanting slogans and throwing banners and shouting out statements without actually debating and performing the functions. So the political structure is no longer ensuring the governance of the efficacy of the whole administration into a proper, efficient way that serves the people in Hong Kong. And it is for that reason that the National People's Congress see the pressing need for that to be taken. Now, of course, this is a matter that is entirely within the central authorities' purview, because it's the NPC and the NPCSC that's going to go through the exercise by making a decision and then amending the annexes 1 and 2. And of course, therefore, these are matters that are within the central authorities. We in the government, of course, do what we can when asked upon to provide such assistance as we would be able to.
Now, if you can speak directly to the Hong Kong people, how will they know what is legal and what is not legal under the national security law, as well as under the new regulations for electoral reform? Again, I come back to what is okay to criticize.
Well, as I said, focusing on what is okay to criticize, I think any fair, objective, fact-based criticism of how certain policies are being promulgated, or how certain policies ought to or ought not to be, what ought to be done, I think it's welcomed by any government. The only requirement is that it has to be rational and fact-based. One must not use quote-unquote fake news and an opinion that is not fact-based, and then try and exacerbate the whole situation into something that is more sensational than rational.
But do you share any of the concerns of the new head of the Hong Kong Bar Association, Paul Harris, who says a lot of these reforms potentially threaten the independent judiciary in Hong Kong? And he's been blasted by state media in Beijing for saying these things.
Well, again, three reactions very quickly. We are a very free society. Anyone can express their opinion, and that, I think, what Mr. Harris said is something that he will say. I will not comment on his comments. The suggestions that it will affect the independence of the judiciary is totally absurd. Our judicial's independence is not based on, is not affected by any legal pressure. It is actually, as the former Chief Justice has said, as our current Chief Justice has said many times, there is no pressure in how they're going to exercise their judicial function in adjudicated cases in accordance with the law and the evidence. So there is no threat on the judicial independence, and I say it loud and clear and with confidence.
Now, the national security law allows you the power to designate whether a trial is held without jury. We're not going to get into individual cases, as you said, but the first one that is coming up under the national security law, the motorcyclist who carried the banners of alleged independence into the police barricade, is going to be without juries. Can you adequately say that this would be the case as well for just about every other defendant under the national security law? Because the justification we've heard, and you can clarify if you like, is that juries could not be guaranteed their safety under such a trial?
We're drifting into discussing the case again, Steve. But let me give you the...
We need to kind of know whether there'll be extrajudicial steps to make sure that the people are not, seeing the transparency of the cases.
Let me give you the principles, and that I think would be the best. Article 46 of the National Security Law, of course, which is part of the prosecutorial decision of Article 63, empowers me in appropriate cases and primarily to protect the safety and of the jurors, as well as for public interest, to ensure that the trial is going to be fairly dealt with, to decide in appropriate cases that there will be no jury and that therefore there will be 3 judges. Now, it's very, one talks about no jury as if it's something that is such a big worrying thing. One mustn't forget that the alternative is that we get 3 judges who are going to decide the case and who are going to write down the reasons and the findings of fact and the legal basis upon which the conclusion of the verdict, be it convict or acquit, is going to be. So there is a very important element that we often overlook. And of course, when the discretion is to be exercised in accordance with Article 46, it will have to be exercised independently and fairly and without any interference from anyone, because exercising that power under Article 46 of the National Security Law is part of the prosecutorial decision process that we have to make in administering and conducting the prosecution exercise, which is, of course, something that is enshrined in Article 63 of the Basic Law, that is not to be interfered by anyone. We
were talking about earlier, and this will be my last question, we were talking earlier about opinions that are factually wrong would they potentially be illegal? I mean, again, in a legislative process, you have checks and balances, and you have the opposition to make sure that elected leaders, elected in air quotes, such as Chief Executive, such as her cabinet, such as yourself, that there are checks and balances and they're held accountable for those actions. And without the opposition, it's hard to see where the gate or the watchdog is, right? So again, you say you have to build, these measures based on fact. Is saying, what's the definition of whose version of facts?
Well, the fact is fact. It's not a matter of whose versions of fact. An opinion is a statement that is supposedly formed with expert view and expert analysis based on facts. If the facts are not established, the opinion is no more than an utterance of no value. And that is why everything must be based on fact. Now, the fact, of course, will have to be ascertained. Some of the statements that are sometimes uttered that we hear are actually not based on facts, or perhaps oblivious of the facts that exist. And I think that is what one has to be very careful not to embark upon.
Okay. Can you confirm what we're hearing as well, that Legislative Council elections will be held in December of this year, delayed from September? Are you...
I am not able to confirm or deny that. I think the Chief Executive already said something along those lines yesterday. I have nothing to add.